Tonight we enter the central drama of Egyptian mythology, the story of Osiris, his reign, his murder, the grief of Isis, the first act of resurrection in recorded religious history, and the long succession dispute that followed. This is the myth that more than any other defined what ancient Egyptians believed happened when a person died, and why. The problem of the Osiris myth in Egyptian texts. Before we enter the narrative itself, it is worth pausing on a methodological point that surprises many people encountering Egyptian mythology for the first time. The Egyptians never wrote the Osiris myth as a single continuous narrative. There is no Egyptian text that tells the story of Osiris from beginning to end in the way that, for example, the Babylonian Enuma Elish tells the story of Marduk, or the way Homer's epics recount the Trojan War. Instead, the Osirian mythology exists in Egyptian sources as a vast distributed archive. Thousands of allusions, ritual specifications, hymns, spell texts, and iconographic representations scattered across an enormous range of documents and monuments spanning more than 3,000 years. The most complete single narrative account of the Osiris myth that survives from antiquity is not Egyptian at all. It is Plutarch's De Isidae et Osiridae, on Isis and Osiris, written in Greek in approximately 120 CE during the reign of the Emperor Hadrian. Plutarch was a Greek philosopher and priest of Apollo at Delphi, deeply interested in Egyptian religion, who compiled the narrative from a combination of Egyptian priestly informants, earlier Greek accounts, and his own philosophical interpretation. De Isidae et Osiridae is an invaluable document, but it must be used carefully. Plutarch writes from a Platonic philosophical perspective, rationalizes and moralizes the myth in ways that reflect his own cultural context, and almost certainly omits or modifies details that conflicted with his interpretive framework. The Egyptian sources themselves are fragmentary, but extensive. The pyramid texts, the Old Kingdom corpus inscribed in royal tombs from approximately 2375 BCE, contain hundreds of allusions to Osirian mythology, mostly in the context of spells intended to identify the deceased pharaoh with Osiris, and thereby guarantee his resurrection. The coffin, texts of the Middle Kingdom, approximately 2055 to 1650 BCE, expand this material and make it available to non-royal individuals. The Book of the Dead, which is less a single book than a fluid collection of spells that scribes assembled to individual commission, with the oldest components dating to the New Kingdom around 1550 BCE, contains numerous passages that presuppose and reference the Osirian narrative. The Great Hymn to Osiris, preserved most completely on the stele of Ahmenmose, Louvre c. 286, 18th dynasty, approximately 1350 BCE, provides the closest thing the Egyptian tradition offers to a continuous narrative summary of the myth in approximately 30 lines of hieroglyphic text. Egyptologists including Jan Assmann, John Gwynne Griffiths, and Mark Smith have devoted substantial scholarly effort to reconstructing the core narrative from these distributed sources, cross-referencing Egyptian texts with Plutarch and with later Greco-Roman accounts. The version that follows draws on this scholarship, where significant variations exist between sources. They will be noted. Osiris, as civilizing, King Egyptian religious tradition holds that before human pharaohs governed Egypt, the land was ruled directly by the gods, a period known as the Zep Tepi, the first time, or first occasion. This concept, documented across a wide range of Egyptian religious texts from the pyramid texts onward, understood the mythological age of divine rule as the originary moment from which all subsequent order derived its legitimacy. The Zep Tepi was not simply the distant past. It was the normative template, the condition that ritual and political action aimed perpetually to recreate and maintain. Within this primordial age of divine governance, Osiris occupied the position of the first properly constituted human-style king, the first ruler who governed not merely through divine power, but through law, through teaching, through the organized management of agriculture and civilization. The pyramid texts describe him as the first of the Westerners, a phrase that would eventually become one of his standard epithets, linking him to the West, the direction of sunset, and therefore of death, and establishing his primacy among the dead. But in his living reign, he was the king of the living, the lord of the fertile black land. The great hymn to Osiris, on the stele of Ahmenmodze, describes his reign in terms that are specific and practical as well as theological. He taught the Egyptians agriculture, instructed them in the proper use of the Nile's inundation cycle, established the legal and moral codes by which human communities should govern themselves, and spread civilization to other lands through peaceful instruction rather than conquest. This characterization of Osiris as a culture hero, a deity who gives humanity its essential civilizational technologies, is consistent across multiple sources and distinguishes him from gods who merely hold power. Osiris was a king who worked. The grain that grew from the black earth was his body made manifest. The flood that delivered that earth was his gift, renewed each year. Isis ruled beside him as queen, the divine consort whose own authority derived from the throne hieroglyph that constituted her name. Egyptian queenship in the historical period mirrored this divine model. The great royal wives of the pharaohs were identified with Isis, their husbands with Osiris in death, or with Horus in life, and the heir who would succeed was identified with the child Horus. The mythological family was the template for the human royal family, and the rituals of the court, the investiture of the pharaoh, the great religious festivals, the protocols of succession, all referenced and reenacted the divine original. Set's position under Osiris. Set, the third child of Nut, occupied a subordinate position under Osiris's reign, a situation the sources indicate he found intolerable. The nature of Set's grievance varies across traditions. Some texts emphasize jealousy of Osiris's power and popularity. Others suggest that Set felt his own qualities, ferocity, strength, the capacity for violence, were being suppressed or undervalued in the orderly, agriculturally focused kingdom of his brother. In the language of Egyptian theological categories, Set was Isfet in its active, personalized form. Not chaos as mere absence of order, but chaos as a positive force that found the constraints of Ma'at intolerable. It is worth noting that Set was not universally cast as a villain in Egyptian religious culture. As discussed in episode 2, he had genuine cult worship, royal devotees, and an essential cosmic function on the solar bark. His role in the Osirian myth as murderer and usurper represents one aspect of a more complex theological figure, the necessary disruptor whose violence, while destructive in one context, is the same force that protects the solar order in another. The Egyptians were comfortable holding both characterizations simultaneously. Set is the enemy of Osiris and the champion of Ra, both things are true. Both things are required. The murder of Osiris is described with varying degrees of specificity across Egyptian and Greco-Roman sources. The most detailed single account is again Plutarch's De Isidae et Osiridae, which describes Set constructing an elaborately decorated chest, a coffin of cedar wood, inlaid with gold and precious stones, crafted to the exact measurements of Osiris's body, and presenting it as a gift at a feast. The guests were invited to try the chest for fit, and whoever matched it perfectly would receive it. One by one they lay in it, and found it too large or too small. When Osiris entered and lay down, 72 conspirators, allies of Set, whom Plutarch names as co-conspirators, rushed forward, slammed the lid shut, sealed it with lead, and threw it into the Nile. The Egyptian sources do not preserve this particular narrative detail with the same clarity, but the general fact of Osiris's violent death at Set's hands is attested from the earliest layers of religious literature. Pyramid text spell 532 refers to Set having thrown Osiris on his side on the bank of Nedit, a place name associated in some traditions with the site of the murder. The coffin texts expand on this, with multiple spells referring to Osiris being felled by Set, being laid on his side, and being prevented from breathing. The image is one of sudden, physical violence, a throwing down, a pinning, a suffocation, consistent with either drowning in a sealed chest or direct assault. The number 72 conspirators in Plutarch's account is not arbitrary. 72 is a significant number in Egyptian astronomical thought. It is the number of days required for a star to become invisible after its heliacal setting, its last appearance before the sun overtakes it in the sky, and also the approximate number of years required for the precession of the equinoxes to shift the celestial pole by 1 degree. Some scholars, including the Egyptologist Eric Hornung, have suggested that the 72 conspirators encode an astronomical myth, the forces of darkness that annually extinguish the stars, though this interpretation is not universally accepted. The location into which the sealed coffin was thrown was the Nile, and it drifted north through the delta and out into the Mediterranean, eventually washing up on the coast of Byblos, the Phoenician city in what is now Lebanon, where a great tree, described variously as a tamarisk or an erica shrub, grew rapidly around the chest and enclosed it within its trunk. The king of Byblos, admiring the exceptional size and fragrance of the tree, had it cut down and fashioned into a pillar for his palace. Osiris was inside the pillar, in the chest, in the palace of a foreign king, hidden, contained, and dead. The death of Osiris posed a theological problem of the first order. Egyptian theology generally understood the gods as immortal, as beings whose existence was not subject to the processes of birth, aging, and dissolution that governed human life. The death of a god was not supposed to happen. It disrupted the fundamental assumption on which the divine order rested. And yet Osiris died, not metaphorically, not temporarily, but actually, physically, irreversibly died. Set killed him. The body was sealed in a chest and submerged in the river. The Egyptian theological response to this problem was not to deny it, but to transform it into something generative. The death of Osiris became the founding event of Egyptian afterlife theology, because Osiris died, and because what followed his death demonstrated that death was not annihilation. Every subsequent death became meaningful in a new way. Every human being who died had a model, a precedent, a template for what their death could mean and what it could become. The death of Osiris did not weaken Egyptian religion. It became its central organizing narrative. The concept of dying and rising deities appears in multiple ancient Near Eastern and Mediterranean religious traditions. The Babylonian Tammuz, the Canaanite Baal, the Greek Adonis, and scholars including James George Fraser, and more recently Bruce Lincoln, have examined the structural similarities between these traditions. The Egyptian case is among the earliest and most thoroughly documented, and it is notable for the degree to which the resurrection is framed not as a divine triumph over death, but as a careful, difficult, technically demanding process accomplished through love, skill, and the proper performance of ritual. Osiris does not simply return to life through divine power. He is brought back through the sustained effort of Isis and the precise execution of mortuary rites, which is to say, through exactly the same processes that the Egyptians applied to their own dead. When Osiris was murdered, Isis was not present. She learned of his death, in Plutarch's account, from the spirit of the tree at Byblos. In Egyptian sources, through the cessation of the divine presence that had animated the world around her, and her response was immediate and consuming. Egyptian texts describe Isis in mourning with remarkable specificity. She cut off a lock of her hair, put on the garments of mourning, and set out to search. The great hymn to Osiris describes her as going through every land in her grief, not resting until she had found him. Isis's grief in the Egyptian tradition is not passive. It is an active, operative force, a form of magical power in its own right. Egyptian lament traditions, documented in texts including the Lamentations of Isis and Nephthys, preserved in Papyrus Bremner Rind, British Museum EA10188, dated to approximately 310 BCE, present the mourning of Isis and Nephthys as a ritual performance that actively called Osiris back to consciousness. The words of the grieving goddesses were understood as having creative force. They named Osiris. They described his qualities. They insisted on his continued existence. And in doing so, they participated in restoring it. The lament was a spell. Grief was Heka. The search for Osiris took Isis across Egypt and eventually to Byblos, where, in Plutarch's version, she arrived disguised as an ordinary woman, was taken into service by the queen as a nurse for the royal infant, and gradually revealed herself. The Byblos episode does not appear in Egyptian sources in this form, and may represent Plutarch's synthesis of the Egyptian myth, with Phoenician traditions about Astarte and Adonis, or with local Biblian myths about the goddess and the sacred tree. What is consistent across sources is the fact of Isis's search in foreign lands, her willingness to cross beyond Egypt's borders, to move through the world of foreigners and the world of the dead, in pursuit of what she had lost. Having found the body and brought it back to Egypt, Isis concealed it in the marshes of the Nile Delta, the papyrus swamps of the region the Egyptians called Chemis, in the far north of the country, where the dense reed beds and shallow waterways made pursuit difficult. Here she performed preliminary resurrection rites over the body. In the version of the myth most consistent across Egyptian sources, conceived the child Horus through a union with the dead Osiris. This event is represented iconographically with considerable frequency in Egyptian funerary art, The kite, a type of bird of prey, hovering over the prone mummiform figure of Osiris. The bird identified as Isis in her transformation form, the act of conception framed as a moment of miraculous threshold crossing between the states of death and life. But Set was not finished. He discovered the hidden body. The sources vary on how. Some suggest he was hunting in the marshes by moonlight. Some that he learned of its location through informants. And in his second act of violence, he dismembered Osiris, cutting the body into 14 pieces. Plutarch gives the number as 14. Some Egyptian sources suggest 42, corresponding to the 42 nomes of Egypt, and scattering them across the land. One piece, the phallus, according to Plutarch, was thrown into the Nile and eaten by 3 fish: the Oxyrhynchus, the Phagrus, and the Lepidotus. These 3 fish species were consequently forbidden as food in various regions of Egypt that maintained taboos associated with the Osirian cult, a detail documented by the Greek geographer Strabo and consistent with locally attested ritual prohibitions in Egyptian administrative texts. The dismemberment of Osiris, his body scattered across the entire extent of Egypt, had a specific theological consequence. Each location where a piece was buried or recovered became a sacred site associated with Osirian cult. Egyptian religious geography mapped the myth onto the physical landscape. Abydos, in Upper Egypt, was identified as the burial place of the head, or, in some traditions, the entire body. Philae in the far south was associated with his leg, Heracleopolis with his thigh, the delta city of Busiris with his backbone, the Djed pillar, one of the most important amulets in Egyptian religious material culture. This geographical distribution of Osiris's body parts transformed all of Egypt into a sacred landscape, a holy land in the most literal sense. The god's body was the country itself. The second search for the 14 scattered pieces of the dismembered body was more systematic than the first. Isis was joined by her sister Nephthys, and together they traveled Egypt from one end to the other, performing rites at each location where a piece was recovered, gradually reassembling the divine body. The image of the 2 sisters searching, one on each side of the land, working toward each other, gathering what Set had scattered, became one of the most enduring visual motifs in Egyptian funerary art, appearing on coffin sides, on canopic chests, on the walls of tombs, on amulets and stelae from every period of Egyptian history. Anubis, the jackal-headed god whose specific domain was the process of embalming and the preparation of the dead for burial, joined the effort. In the mythological genealogy of the later tradition, Anubis was the son of Osiris and Nephthys, born from a union that occurred when Nephthys disguised herself as Isis. He was therefore Osiris's own son, and his assistance in restoring his father's body had both familial and professional dimensions. Anubis performed the first embalming, the wrapping of Osiris's assembled body in linen, the application of resins and oils, the recitation of the spells that would preserve the physical form through which Osiris's spiritual components could remain coherently organized. This mythological event, the first embalming performed by Anubis on the body of Osiris, was the divine prototype for all subsequent Egyptian mortuary practice. Every embalmer who practiced in Egypt was understood as repeating what Anubis had done first. The head embalmer at Egyptian funerary establishments customarily wore a jackal-headed mask during the most sacred portions of the embalming process, literally becoming Anubis for the duration of the ritual. The deceased became, for ritual purposes, Osiris. The family of the deceased became Isis and Nephthys. The entire apparatus of Egyptian mortuary practice was a continuous reenactment of the mythological original. The physical procedures of Egyptian embalming, natron salt desiccation, organ removal into canopic jars, linen wrapping, application of resins, are documented in detail in multiple sources, including the work of the Greek historian Herodotus, and more recently through scientific analysis of mummified remains using techniques including computed tomography, gas chromatography, and mass spectrometry. The biochemistry of Egyptian embalming resins has been studied in detail by researchers including Jana Jones and Stephen Buckley, whose 2014 analysis of prehistoric burial wrappings from Mostagedda demonstrated that the chemical signature of the embalming tradition was established in the pre-dynastic period, before the formal development of the Osirian theological framework that would eventually explain and authorize these practices. The ritual came first. The myth grew around it, or grew alongside it, providing the theological narrative that gave the technical procedure its sacred meaning. The resurrection of Osiris is one of the most carefully nuanced concepts in Egyptian theology, and it is important to understand what it was and what it was not. Osiris was not simply brought back to life in the sense of resuming his previous existence, eating, ruling, walking, engaging with the living world. What was restored was something more specific and more limited, a sufficient degree of divine vitality to allow his spiritual components, the Ba, the Ka, the Aa, to remain coherently organized, and specifically to allow him to father a child with Isis before returning to the state of death. After this, Osiris descended permanently to the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, and became its ruler, the king of the dead rather than the king of the living. He did not return to the throne of Egypt. He became something new, the first being to have died and been restored to a form of existence beyond death, the prototype of every justified dead person who would follow him. The Egyptian theological vocabulary for the components of the human person, the Ba, Ka, Hak, Ren, Shut, and Eb, is relevant here and worth examining briefly. The Ka was the vital force or double generated at birth that animated the body and required continuous sustenance through offerings at the tomb. The Bah was the individual personality or soul, depicted as a human-headed bird that could move between the tomb and the world of the living. The Ahk, often translated as transfigured spirit or effective spirit, was the glorified post-mortem form of the individual who had successfully completed the judgment and been integrated into the divine order. The Ren was the name, understood as a component of identity with real existence. To erase a person's name was to damage their existence in a meaningful sense. The Shut was the shadow, another aspect of individual presence. The Ee was the heart, the physical heart, which was also the seat of consciousness, memory, and moral identity, and which would be weighed against the feather of Ma'at at judgment. The resurrection rites performed by Isis and Nephthys, including the opening of the mouth ceremony, in which a ritual instrument was touched to the face of the mummified body to restore the senses, restored Osiris's Ba and Ka to sufficient functional coherence for the miraculous conception of Horus. After this, the coherence was again disrupted. Osiris died, again in the sense of losing the vitality of the living, but retained the organized existence of the properly prepared dead. His aegik, his transfigured spirit, was complete. He was the first aegik, the model for all who followed. Osiris's permanent residence in the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, gave that realm its definitive theological character. The Duat was not simply a place of the dead. It was the kingdom of Osiris, organized and governed on principles analogous to the kingdom of the living, but appropriate to the state of the dead. Its geography is described in extraordinary detail in the books of the Netherworld, the Amduat, the Book of Gates, the Book of Caverns, the Book of the Earth, which were inscribed on the walls of New Kingdom royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, and which collectively constitute one of the most extensive cartographies of an afterlife realm in the ancient world. The Duat was not uniformly dark or uniformly pleasant. It was structured, differentiated, populated. Different regions had different characteristics, some luminous, some terrifying, some agricultural, some dominated by fire. The souls of the dead traveled through it in sequence, encountering specific challenges and specific divine beings at each stage. The solar bark of Ra passed through the Duat each night, bringing light temporarily to each of its 12 hours. And the souls of the dead who occupied those regions were briefly revived by Ra's passage. When Ra moved on, and the hour returned to darkness, the souls returned to their sleep. The nightly passage of Ra through the Duat was understood as a mutual benefit. Ra needed the company and magical assistance of the dead to repel Arpep. The dead needed Ra's light to maintain their vitality. Osiris presided over the final hour of the Duat, or in some texts, over the judgment hall that was the destination of all arriving souls. He sat on his throne in his characteristic mummiform posture, the crook and flail in his hands, wearing the Artef crown, surrounded by the 42 divine assessors and the apparatus of cosmic justice. He was simultaneously judge and template, the judge who determined whether souls had earned the resurrection he himself had achieved, and the model of what that resurrection looked like. Every soul that passed his judgment and was declared true of voice, Ma Karu, would follow the path he had established. Anubis, Egyptian Ianpu, a name of uncertain etymology, is among the most ancient deities in the Egyptian pantheon, with attestations from the earliest written records of the pre-dynastic and early dynastic periods, predating the fully developed Osirian theological system by centuries. In the earliest layers of Egyptian funerary religion, before the Osirian narrative had been elaborated into its classical form, Anubis was the primary god of the dead, the lord of the necropolis, the guardian of the tomb, the deity who presided over burial and afterlife transition, without reference to the Osirian framework that would later contextualize and in some ways subordinate his functions. The association of Anubis with the jackal, specifically the golden jackal, Canis aureus, or the African wolf, Canis lupister, species that inhabited the desert margins of the Nile Valley and were frequently observed near burial grounds, has both practical and symbolic dimensions. On the practical level, jackals were genuinely common presences at cemeteries. Their burrowing and scavenging activities around graves made them visible and associated with death in the minds of those who lived and buried their dead near the desert edge. On the symbolic level, the jackal's liminal ecology, inhabiting the boundary between the inhabited Nile Valley and the dead desert, crossing between the world of the living and the domain of the dead, made it an appropriate embodiment of a deity whose function was precisely that boundary crossing. Anubis's iconography is distinctive and consistent. The jackal-headed man, or the recumbent black jackal, with an alert posture, ears raised, watchful. The black coloring of the divine jackal form is significant. It is not the natural tawny color of the golden jackal, but the black of the Nile silt, the black of the resins used in mummification, the black associated with fertility and regeneration. Black in Egyptian symbolic color coding was not the color of death in the Western sense. It was the color of the fertile earth from which life emerged, and its application to Anubis connected his funerary functions to the regenerative dimension of death. Death as the precondition for new life, not as its termination. Anubis's most famous and most frequently depicted function is his role in the psychostasia, the weighing of the heart, which appears in Egyptian funerary art from the New Kingdom period onward, and is represented in extraordinary detail and frequency in illustrated papyri of the Book of the Dead. The scene is among the most reproduced images from Egyptian antiquity, and its symbolic vocabulary is precise. The Judgment Hall, the Hall of Two Truths, or Eret Mart, contained a great set of scales, a balance of the kind used throughout Egypt for commercial and administrative weighing. On one pan of the scales was placed the heart, EEB, of the deceased, the physical organ removed during mummification, and, in the judgment context, returned to function as the locus of the individual's moral record. On the other pan was placed the feather of Mart, a single ostrich feather, the symbol of the goddess of cosmic order, truth, and justice. Anubis attended the scales, adjusting them, reading the result, ensuring the accuracy of the measurement. Thoth stood nearby with palette and scribal equipment, recording the verdict. The 42 divine assessors occupied the hall, one for each of the 42 nomes of Egypt, and each for one of the 42 sins enumerated in the negative confession, the declaration of innocence that the deceased recited upon entering the hall. The full text of the negative confession, preserved in chapter 125 of the Book of the Dead, lists specific transgressions. I have not robbed. I have not been violent. I have not stolen. I have not killed people. I have not damaged the grain measure. I have not taken milk from the mouths of children. The specificity is striking. These are not abstract moral categories, but particular acts that the deceased denies having committed, addressed to specific divine judges responsible for specific infractions. If the heart balanced with the feather, indicating that the deceased had lived in accordance with Mart and had not committed the listed transgressions, Anubis declared the result to Thoth, who recorded it, and the deceased was admitted to the presence of Osiris, and subsequently to the field of reeds. If the heart was heavier than the feather, the balance tipped, and Amit, the composite devouring monster who waited beside the scales, part lion, part hippopotamus, part crocodile, consumed the heart. The soul of the unworthy dead was thereby destroyed, not sent to a place of punishment, but annihilated. The Egyptian concept of damnation was not eternal torment, but the obliteration of individual existence, the cessation of the name, the dissolution of the person. For a culture that invested enormously in the preservation of individual identity across the threshold of death, this was the worst possible outcome. The weighing of the heart is documented not only in funerary papyri, but in monumental contexts. The tomb of Hunnefer, British Museum, EA 9901, 19th Dynasty, approximately 1275 BCE, contains one of the most beautifully executed and fully labelled versions of the scene, with Anubis shown adjusting the scales while Amit crouches expectantly nearby. The completeness of the labelling in such scenes, every figure identified by name and function, reflects the Egyptian understanding that the image was not merely decorative but operational. A correctly executed image of the judgment placed in the tomb participated in making the judgment proceed correctly for the tomb's owner. The child conceived by Isis over the dead body of Osiris, the posthumous son of the murdered king, heir to a throne currently occupied by his father's killer, was born in secret in the marshes of the Nile Delta. The location, Chemis, was chosen for its inaccessibility. The dense papyrus swamps of the far north of Egypt, where the many branched Nile Delta, fragmented into a maze of channels and reed beds, where even a determined pursuer might spend months without covering the terrain. Isis raised her son there, alone, in concealment, nursing him and performing protective spells over him. The childhood of Horus in the marshes is the subject of a distinct body of Egyptian religious texts and ritual objects. The Chippy of Horus, carved stone or faience plaques depicting the young Horus as a naked child standing on crocodiles, holding snakes and scorpions in his outstretched hands, are attested from the late period, approximately 664 to 332 BCE onward, and were used as protective devices. Water poured over a chippy acquired the healing properties of the spells inscribed on it, particularly for snakebite and scorpion sting. The Metternich Stele, Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York, dated to the reign of Nectanebo II, approximately 360 BCE, is the largest and most elaborately inscribed surviving example, and preserves numerous spells of this type in their most complete form. The mythological basis for these healing objects was a series of episodes in which the infant Horus fell ill, bitten by a scorpion or snake, afflicted by unspecified illness, and was healed by Isis through magical intervention. These stories served as narrative precedents. Because Isis had healed Horus under these specific circumstances, the spell that recorded her healing words retained its efficacy for any subsequent victim of the same afflictions. The mythological event and the ritual application were explicitly linked. To recite the spell was to repeat what Isis had done and to participate in its efficacy. The posthumous conception of Horus, his father dead at the time of his begetting, raised specific theological questions that Egyptian religious thought addressed with characteristic care. How could a dead man father a child? What was the nature of the reproductive act performed by Isis over Osiris's body? And what did this imply about Horus's nature and status? The Egyptian answer, worked out across multiple texts and periods, was that the act was possible precisely because of Isis's extraordinary magical power, her ability to operate in the liminal space between life and death in ways that no other deity could. The Osiris who fathered Horus was not fully alive, but not fully dead either. He was in the transitional state produced by Isis's resurrection rite, a state of threshold existence that was unique to that moment and was never reproduced. Horus was therefore the product of a singular, unrepeatable event, which contributed to his unique theological status as the destined king, the one being who had been specifically generated for the purpose of reclaiming his father's throne. Horus's paternity also had a specific legal implication within Egyptian political theology. Egyptian inheritance law recognized posthumous children, children conceived before a father's death but born after it, as legitimate heirs. Horus, conceived from the dead Osiris, occupied a legal theological position as the legitimate heir of the murdered king. His claim to the throne of Egypt was not merely sentimental or filial. It was juridically grounded in the same principles that governed human inheritance. The divine tribunal that would eventually adjudicate his claim was applying to divine figures the same legal reasoning that Egyptian courts applied to human succession disputes. The dispute between Horus and Set over the kingship of Egypt is documented across many sources, but its most extensive and literary treatment appears in Papyrus Chester Beatty I, a hieratic papyrus. Hieratic being the cursive script used for non-monumental Egyptian writing, now held in the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin, dated to the reign of Ramesses V, approximately 1147 BCE, and written by a scribe named Kenher Kopashef, or one of his circle. The text, known to Egyptologists as the Contendings of Horus and Set, is a narrative of unusual literary character for Egyptian religious texts. It is sophisticated, ironic, and at points genuinely comedic in ways that complicate the simple reading of it as pious mythology. The Contendings describes a tribunal of the gods, the divine council, presided over in various episodes by Ra-Horakhti, by Shu, or by the council collectively, that has been deliberating for 80 years without reaching a verdict. The two claimants have each presented their cases. Horus argues his right as the legitimate son and heir of Osiris. Set argues his right as the most powerful deity, the defender of Ra on the solar bark, the strongest candidate for the office of king. Both arguments have merit within Egyptian theological categories, which is precisely why the tribunal cannot resolve the dispute. The Contendings consists of a series of episodes, tests, schemes, and judicial debates, in which neither party consistently prevails, and the tribunal's authority is repeatedly strained. Several episodes deserve detailed attention for what they reveal about Egyptian conceptions of divine personality and political legitimacy. In one early episode, Ra-Horakhti, who appears to favor Set and resents what he considers the tribunal's failure to recognize Set's superior qualifications, refuses to continue the proceedings and withdraws to his pavilion. The gods are at a loss. Without Ra's authority, the tribunal lacks its ultimate sanction. The solution comes from Hathor, the goddess of love and joy, who approaches Ra and reveals herself to him in a manner that makes him laugh, restoring his good humor and his willingness to return to the assembly. This episode is sometimes described euphemistically in translations, but the text is explicit. Hathor's exposure of herself to Ra is the mechanism of his recovery. The gods used what worked. Theological dignity was secondary to practical necessity. The exchange of letters with Neith, the ancient war goddess of Sis, one of the oldest deities in the Egyptian pantheon, represents a different kind of procedural maneuver. The divine council, unable to reach agreement, writes to Neith requesting her opinion. Her reply, as transmitted through Thoth, who reads it aloud to the assembly, is unambiguous and slightly contemptuous. Give the office to Horus. The legal reasoning she offers is specific. Osiris was the previous king. Horus is his son. The principle of patrilineal succession should govern. And she adds an incentive for Set. Compensate him with additional possessions and 2 foreign goddesses as wives. This is the language of practical political settlement, not theological abstraction. Neith's letter reads like a competent administrative ruling, and Thoth records it as such. The hippopotamus episode is among the most physically dramatic in the text. Horus and Set agree to transform themselves into hippopotamuses and submerge themselves in the river. Whoever surfaces first loses the contest. Isis, watching from the bank and unable to contain her anxiety, fashions a copper harpoon and throws it into the water, intending to strike Set. Instead, she strikes Horus. He cries out from underwater that she has wounded him. Horrified, she commands the harpoon to release him. She refashions it and throws it again, this time striking Set. Set, from beneath the surface, calls out to her as her brother, invoking their kinship. Isis is moved by this appeal and again commands the harpoon to release its target. Horus, furious at his mother's hesitation, emerges from the water and decapitates her, or in some versions, removes her crown. This extreme act of filial violence is itself a theological problem that the text addresses. Thoth replaces Isis's head with a cow's head, or restores her, depending on the version, and Horus is subsequently punished by Ra for his action. The episode resists clean interpretation, but it demonstrates that the Contendings is not a straightforward morality tale. The rightful claimant does wrong things. The guilty party has sympathetic moments. The proceedings are not orderly. The episode in which Set attempts to establish sexual dominance over Horus, understood in Egyptian political theology as establishing Set's superior status, is described explicitly in the text. Set approaches Horus with apparent friendliness, and the assault occurs while Horus is unguarded. Horus, however, catches Set's semen in his hands before it can achieve its goal and reports the matter to Isis. She responds with characteristic practical ingenuity. She collects Horus's own semen, applies it to lettuce plants in Set's garden, lettuce being an aphrodisiac food associated with sexual potency in Egyptian culture, and Set, not knowing, eats the lettuces. When the tribunal convenes, Set boasts that he has established dominance over Horus. The gods summon the semen of both parties. Set's semen responds from the marshes where Isis had disposed of it, while Horus's semen responds from within Set's own body. Set is humiliated before the assembly. His boast has been not merely refuted, but precisely inverted. This episode, which appears grotesque or merely comic in isolation, operates within a coherent system of Egyptian political thought. Sexual dominance in the Egyptian symbolic order was a genuine assertion of superior status, a claim to the active, governing role in any relationship. The Contendings invokes this system and then systematically subverts it. Set's attempted assertion of dominance becomes evidence of his subordination. The mechanism is Isis's magic, as usual. She does not prevent the assault, but redirects its consequences. The outcome of the divine tribunal is shaped not by Set's violence, but by Isis's patient redirection of that violence against its author. After 80 years of deliberation, a figure that may be numerically symbolic rather than literal, representing the complete span of divine deliberation, the tribunal reached a verdict. The final determination came from Geb, the earth god and original king, whose authority over the succession was foundational. He had been the previous holder of the divine kingship before passing it to Osiris, and the office had therefore originated with him in the divine genealogy. Geb ruled in favor of Horus. The legal reasoning, as reconstructed from Egyptian sources, rested on two principles. First, the principle of patrilineal succession. Osiris had been the legitimate king, Horus was his legitimate son, and the kingship therefore descended to Horus in accordance with the same inheritance principles that governed human property and title in Egyptian law. Second, the specific condemnation of Set's method of obtaining power. Set had murdered the previous king. A claim obtained through the murder of one's predecessor was, within Egyptian legal theology, fundamentally compromised. Set's strength, his qualifications, even his genuine usefulness to the divine order, could not override the illegitimacy of the process by which he had acquired power. Set was not destroyed or permanently diminished. He was reassigned, given dominion over the desert, over foreign lands, over the storms and the chaotic periphery of the ordered world. He became Ra's champion against Arpep in perpetuity, the necessary violence at the edge of the cosmos, contained within a function that made it beneficial rather than destructive. This settlement reflects Egyptian theological pragmatism. Set was too powerful and too necessary to simply eliminate, and the Egyptians had no tradition of demonizing him out of existence. He remained part of the divine order, occupying the ecological niche his nature was suited for, which was outside the boundaries of the organized, agricultural, lawful Egypt that Osiris had ruled, and Horus now inherited. Horus was crowned king of Egypt. The ceremony is described in various sources as involving investiture by Geb, acclamation by the divine council, and the formal assumption of the double crown, the Peshent, combining the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt, that signified unified rule over the entire Nile Valley. From this point forward, every living pharaoh of Egypt was identified as Horus, the legitimate heir of the divine succession, the earthly manifestation of the falcon ski god, ruling the land that his father Osiris had embodied, and that his grandfather Geb had originally governed. Every dead pharaoh became Osiris, the justified dead king, ruling the Duat as Osiris ruled it, maintaining the cosmic order from within the realm of the dead. The mythological system was closed, consistent, and politically comprehensive. The Osirian cycle is the theological center of gravity around which most Egyptian religious thought organized itself. The murder, the search, the resurrection, the judgment, the succession. Each element of this narrative generated a corresponding institution: mortuary practice, funerary literature, royal theology, the administration of justice. The myth was not separate from Egyptian civilization. It was the template that gave Egyptian civilization its specific shape. In episode 4, we will move outward from the Osirian core to the broader pantheon, the gods of craft and love, of music and healing, of the Nile and its creatures. The divine family has established its order. The world is running. Now we examine who else lives in it. Horus is on the throne. Osiris is in the Duat. The scales have been balanced. Sleep